Nobody gets into trust and safety because they think they're going to have an easy life. A lot of people I find who are in trust and safety are trying to get back to good, because what we've created, if you think about that, right, the ability to connect one another.
I'm John Starr, advisor at Thorn.
I'm Paylez Halai, Senior Manager of Partnerships at Thorn.
And this is Safe Space. Speaking of having to navigate some of those problem-finding situations and maybe problem-solving situations, you've, again, been able to build a community of trust and safety folks. Are there common themes that you see in those humans? Like what are those group of folks bring to the table that you've kind of observed?
I love that question because actually it came up recently where we had a safety by design gathering in New York a few weeks ago. I remember that was one of the parts that I was reflecting on. Nobody gets into trust and safety because they think they're going to have an easy life.
Right.
But that bears emphasis and repeating,
Mm-hmm.
because I think sometimes trust and safety is a very widely misunderstood field. It's also a relatively nascent space that people are sometimes just discovering, and then they're trying to figure it out. But you ask about the common bond, and there is a common bond. And honestly, this is the common bond even with all tech is human. I think we've over-indexed on thinking of issues as purely with the head or academic. When I look at people, when I interact with people who are in trust and safety all the time, those are people that if you actually dig beneath the surface, there's usually a deeper motivation. Again, if you want to make a good living, there's lots of ways to make a buck. Why would you try to wade in the sewer of the internet? There is a larger motivation. So it's similar to how when you talk to an actor, they base everything on what's your motivation. So it's something I like to kind of think about. So when I think about the motivation of people who get into trust and safety, it's not usually said out loud, but when you actually sit down and have a beer with somebody, you start finding out that these are really important issues because they probably came up in an age like I did, where you viewed the ability to connect one another across the globe as a net positive, as something that could lead us to recognize that we have less differences, that it could allow us to easily communicate with one another. So whether you were in, Kenosha, Wisconsin, or upstate New York, where I grew up in Oneonta, New York, you had access to the world's greatest scholars' information. It's what they called the information superhighway at the time.
Yeah.
The idea there is that a lot of people I find who are in trust and safety are trying to get back to good, because what we've created, if you think about that, right, the ability to connect one another with the web and what we've done with social media, I do think personally it does have amazing potential. And I think one of the frustration that I recognize in a lot of trust and safety professionals is wanting to build back better, right? Wanting to get at the positive aspects of why we can connect with one another, and recognizing it's not a set it and forget it, if you like your infomercials.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not a set it and forget it scenario. And honestly, I think that's also going back to the earlier part of the discussion. That's one of the reasons why you need all different backgrounds. This is a scenario where you need, philosophers and ethicists and psychologists and game theorists, because they're also individuals that recognize that something doesn't just magically happen. We have to consider human behavior. We have to consider how people act in groups. We have to consider vulnerabilities. That's not a strict technologist type of background, which is why trust and safety is such an important field, because so many different backgrounds come together.
Yeah, one of the things that I wrote down, get back to good. I think one of the things that I think maybe misunderstood, or at least unclear at first, but to your point on sitting down, having a beer, a coffee, a tea with someone in this field, is they're full of problem finders. They're also full of problem solvers. That said, you mentioned the sewer of the internet. Yeah. I think a lot of people might assume that these folks are pessimistic about the world. And that's couldn't be further from the truth of my experience of the humans that work in this field, who do see awful things every day, who do have to contemplate trade-offs that oftentimes are lose-lose trade-offs at the speed and scale of the internet. And yet they remain incredibly optimistic about the internet, incredibly
Yeah.
optimistic, generally speaking. This idea of getting back to good and understanding the power of the internet and the future of the internet and how we can shape that today. You mentioned in a few talks that you were framing the community as the community attached to power. I would love for you to touch on that for kind of a moment. And is there anything surprising or transformative that you've experienced throughout building this community attached to power that you'd like to share?
I like to say that my life is filled with dissonance. And honestly, I think this is very common for everybody in trust and safety who's tangentially related to trust and safety. There's tremendous highs and lows. On one hand, you're constantly knee deep in tragedy. You're dealing with how certain design decisions might influence human behavior, or incentive structures might get in the way of creating a social experience that maybe allows for human flourishing. But at the same time, the part that really kind of keeps me going is the community, right? So every time we have these gatherings, and we've had dozens of gatherings, thousands of people who come together. It's really quite inspiring. Because again, to that earlier point, these aren't people who are in it for money. These are people who are in it because they actually care deeply about people and care about the fabric of society. People are drawn into fighting the worst because they care about the best. They deeply care about improving this scenario. But the parts, to your point, that have surprised me is just really around the immense tension that sometimes happens in the trust and safety space. I think what we're struggling with, what I'm seeing, is that people in trust and safety sometimes can feel attacked from multiple angles, and it's a highly stressful field. You can get PTSD. Early on, people were talking about this. So before Casey Newton, when he had a pretty well-known article when he was with The Verge, there was also Sarah T. Roberts, a researcher at UCLA, who came out with a documentary called The Cleaners to feature some of her work, but really just talking about the fact that there's always a human kind of involved in this. So the part that I think has surprised a lot of people is that AI has not been as effective as a lot of people predicted around removing humans from having to deal with the worst of the worst. And I would also throw in there that this is why I think we're starting to allow more conversations around friction and the importance of friction. So obviously a famous incident dealing with trust and safety was a few years ago with the Christchurch incident that led to the Christchurch call. When you think about that, one of the struggles was that so many of these horrendous videos could get quickly uploaded and re-uploaded to YouTube. So it was a whack-a-mole scenario where they would take down a video and then someone would upload a video. So really there you have a very similar scenario with what happened with the time delay rule in live television. That time delay rule didn't happen because somebody was sitting back in early television and said, what we really need? It wasn't something that they had naturally predicted, but it was from a terrible live incident that occurred. And then after that, they recognized that they need a time delay. I think you have the same thing that's happening in a lot of social media spaces, that we're recognizing that there's an inherent trade-off from the speed that people want something, right? You want to think of an idea, it goes from head to said really, really quickly, but that actually limits the time that you have to, one, be thoughtful about the content, which means that you have more sewage, right? And I think that's an important part is thinking about reducing the amount of original terrible content, and then also increasing our abilities to reduce terrible content once it's in the system. Those are two really distinct parts, but they operate in tandem.
This is just part of the conversation with David Polgar. You can catch more highlights and the full Safe Space episode here.